I'm Vivian Manasc, and happy to be talking with you this afternoon about using wood in construction, and specifically about our work with Indigenous communities and how we've come to use so much wood over the years and where that's heading to going forward. I grew up in Montreal. I moved to Montreal from Romania in the early 1960s, and grew up at the heady time of Expo. So Montreal was a city that was full of architecture, full of the future, full of optimism, and full of a sense of Canada that was really inspiring, I think, for young immigrant kids and for people who'd lived here for a long time too. I ended up in architecture school at McGill at the time of the first energy crisis. And it was a really interesting moment to be studying architecture when the world was talking about being out of gas, and we were all thinking about how our decisions influence the long-term well-being of our planet as well as of our communities. So thinking about sustainability was really at the heart of our conversation during those years, during those early 70s, when that first energy crisis really shook the world. So a number of years later, I ended up in Western Canada, and then I ended up actually in Northern Canada. I ended up in Nunavut, of all places, which is a really fascinating corner of the world, about as far north and as far west as you're likely to ever go within much of Canada. And in Nunavut, I got a whole new perspective on how we as Canadians live amongst Indigenous communities and with this extraordinary landscape that is the North, and that is Canada, really, in a really remarkable way. One of the things you notice a lot, though, when you start working in the North, and you start noticing it in communities like Nunavut, you start noticing it on reserve communities, First Nations communities where we continue to work over the years. You start to notice that there's a lot of buildings that are rather in poor condition, rather not well maintained, not well looked after, and even though some of them are lovely buildings, they tend to get quite beaten up. And so in those early years when I was working in Nunavut and then later in Northern Alberta, I started to ask those questions. I started to understand why it was that there are so many buildings that, really with the best of intentions were really looking quite poorly. And this was in the mid-80s. We started to work in a Northern Alberta community known then as Assumption, or today as Châté. And at Châté, we started to work with the community and asked the chief, asked the elders, asked young people, asked the teachers, what it was about those existing buildings that was causing them to be in such poor condition. And one of the things we heard very early on is that, people had learned the craftsmanship of making buildings out of wood. They'd learned how to make homes, they'd learned how to everything from log homes to more contemporary frame houses. But there was really almost nobody in the community that had the skills to work with other materials. So wood buildings were something that people considered to be maintainable, whereas other building materials like metal cladding, for example, or metal structures were always considered to be, you had to get somebody else from outside the community to come in and maintain that building. So they didn't get maintained. So metal buildings and all kinds of buildings that had been built with the best of intentions on reserve and in remote communities really started to deteriorate, and these communities started to look worse and worse. And it struck me that there had to be a better way. There had to be a solution that involved people in the community. And by talking to people, it became clear that designing and building in wood was really a part of that solution. One of the early projects that we designed up in Grise Fjord in the Northwest Territories, or then the Northwest Territories, now Nunavut, which is on the southern end of Ellesmere Island. And in Grise Fjord, we designed a health center that had to be, all the materials had to be brought in on a single barge. So again, another reason why we wanted to design in wood. So not only was it accessible to people in terms of local skills and local crafts and trades, but it was also possible to ship building materials from the south in a compact enough way that they would fit in a single container. And there's only one sea lift per year that goes into Grise Fiord. So if you've ever had to ship materials into the high Arctic, you'll know what that means, which is that to say that all of the building materials for the entire construction had to be packaged and shipped tight from the Port of Montreal all at once. And again, wood was the right material, right for the structure, right for the cladding, material that made sense in terms of fitting compactly and being light enough that it could easily be transported in that single sea lift per year. In those early years, we started to work with communities across Western and Northern Canada. We started to work with kids to envision what it was that was important to them about the design of their buildings. We started to look at traditional structures like, of course, teepees that were still and are still being constructed all through Western and not so much in the north, but definitely through the west. We started to look at what people were asking for, what was important to them in terms of the kinds of building materials that we were constructing. And again, wood shows up as the material of choice. So we, little by little, we're growing the number of reasons why wood was really the material that we preferred for so many of these buildings in these First Nations communities across the north. And the kids in the communities, the adults, the teachers, the students, everybody was excited about having materials that are warm and friendly. This was the first really large junior-senior high school project that we designed and had built in Alberta. And on reserve, again, there was the question of designing out of wood because people could build it themselves, could maintain it themselves. It's a building that was designed with a huge amount of community engagement. So by this stage in our journey of designing buildings, we were more and more involving people in the design process and also in the construction process. Trades training became increasingly important, even as far back as the early 90s, and still increasingly important today. These buildings, such as Soddle Lake, resulted in people actually getting their journeyman's tickets because there were so many work hours available for local tradespeople that they could actually get enough hours in to become journeymen. And so these projects became not only a focus on creating great learning environments for kids, but also creating a sustainable workforce for the community. And at Soddle Lake, for example, we had over 90% local labor during the whole construction project of this building. Working up in the Yukon, again, people really felt strongly about having buildings made of wood, even though there's not as much wood up there. In fact, trees are rather small and rather sparse in the Yukon. But again, designing with wood really resonated for the community and resonated for people who were trying to tell a story about tourism and about why you should go visit the north and go visit the Yukon. So this was designed as a visitor center and again, a wood structure that really privileged materials that were coming, in this case, mostly from BC, but definitely resonant for the community in the Whitehorse area. And again, we continued to work with kids and try to imagine what was possible for their communities. And designing with community became increasingly important over these years as we started to understand that designing with wood and designing with community created sustainable opportunities, created possibilities to design buildings that were healthier for people as well as for the planet. So, this is an example of the kind of collage workshops that we do with kids and communities, but also with seniors and with elders and with teachers. And over we see these kinds of things, natural products, green products, and you can see in these collages how often wood shows up as a material of choice. So really we're being sort of inspired to use wood by the community as well as by their desire to create jobs and employment. So wherever we go across northern Alberta, across northern Saskatchewan, across even into northern BC, we see communities that are continuing to maintain and strengthen their culture, their traditions, and their teachings through the use of teepee teachings, for example. Using those teachings, they're inspiring their next generation, and we're inspired to think about the kind of materials and the kind of buildings we want to co-create with those communities, so that those facilities, those buildings, actually make sense to those communities, and that they care about them, that they want to maintain them for many years to come. Because really it's about stewardship, right? It's about caring for our built environment over decades and decades. So when we designed the school at Driftpile, for example, we worked very closely again with the community to try to discover not only what were the kind of best learning environments for kids, but also what was important to the elders, what had to be evoked in the design of this building in order for the elders to be able to continue sharing the stories of these buildings. And so in this case, this was actually designed in the shape of a feather. The feather really inspired the place called Driftpile. It was a drift pile on Lesser Slave Lake where the eagles nested. And so the feathers were really the image that drew together this community and that enabled the community to share their history and their stories. The school at Driftpile was designed as a kindergarten to grade 12 school. So it was designed for really little kids and for really big kids. And you can see that the really little end of it was designed so that kids could feel that the building had its appropriate scale for them when they're young, when they're little. And then the building becomes larger and larger as you grow into high school level courses like industrial arts and home economics and so on. So the wood building really enabled that shift of scale over the course of the entire building and still maintaining that warmth of material consistency throughout. And again, interpreting the story. So this is actually the ceiling in the multipurpose room in Driftpile School, and you can see this swirling. This is again intended to evoke the form of a feather as it falls to the earth. And so in the ceiling, there's this ability for the elders to sit with the youth to share their stories about why these feathers are the really symbolic importance of the continuity of tradition. A few years later, we worked on the school at O'Cheese, and again, interpreting culture, interpreting tradition, using wood as an interior material to bring color, to bring texture, and to bring a sort of a sense of beadwork in this case, because in this community at O'Cheese, that texture of the beadwork was really important to the community to evoke that sense of craftsmanship that was celebrated in that region. So as we were working through these many communities, I started to read more and more Indigenous authors, Indigenous thinkers, people who are talking about what's important and how do we understand what we're hearing from these communities in the context of culture, in the context of tradition, and in the context of materials that we're thinking about as we design buildings. And this particular story is from Thomas King. It really reminds us that the stories that we share, the stories that we hear, are essentially the same story over and over, just told in different ways. And so Thomas King, who's still alive, a very erudite elder statesman, I guess, of contemporary Indigenous writing in Canada, is definitely one of those touchstones who helps us understand our context within the world of First Nations thinking. And little by little, we started to understand that it's not just in the designed object that our stories lie, but actually in the process of design. So as I said, we've been working through community engagement and getting stories, starting to understand that actually each step of our design process is informed by an Indigenous worldview. And this is really what shifted in our own practice, is that it's not only that we design for and with Indigenous communities, but our design process has shifted to align better with an Indigenous perspective. So rather than sort of the kind of linear design and construction process that you might think of in conventional practice, we think about a circular design process that is focused on envisioning with courage, focused on planning with love for the community, focused on designing with wisdom, inspired by the wisdom of the community, focusing on detailing our buildings with respect, the respect for the craftsmanship and the knowledge of people in the community, but also of the tradespeople who are going to be constructing our building. Then we build, where we always think of that as a bit the moment of truth, because everything comes together on site and then we're building. And that's also the time when people in the community get to actually participate in constructing those buildings. Then we celebrate. We celebrate with humility and thanks for all of the work that was done to construct the building. And then we evaluate with honesty. So those 7 teachings are the teachings, Cree teachings that were shared with me by some of the elders that I've worked with, teachings that I've adapted to our practice of working with Indigenous communities in the design of, be it schools, be it community facilities, or other cultural facilities in the community. Another building, this one in northern Saskatchewan, where we worked with the Dene community up in Stony Rapids, Black Lake, Stony Rapids area. This is a healthcare facility, place where you can hear the sounds of the river even when it's -60 outside. And again, we were challenged to design a building that had to be packaged up and brought up to the community by winter roads or by very limited barge access. And again, we chose wood as a material because there were local people who knew how to work with wood, and because it was lighter and more practical, more adaptable and more sustainable than other materials that we could have chosen. And so the community worked on this building, and it's basically a hospital, a community health center that includes long-term care, acute care, birthing center, and lots of other community health programs. And again, there it is. That's the front entrance of it. And again, it's a wood building, which really makes it a place that people in the community are very proud of, and people in the community were involved in the design and construction, and they've taken remarkably good care of it. In fact, you know, if you look at the annual reports that they publish on their website, it's quite lovely to see, you know, flowers all decorating the front of the building, and, you know, just a lot of care and attention, a lot of attention to the importance of this building to the community. Using wood wasn't just limited to First Nations projects. We started to use wood more and more for so many other buildings, because what inspired us was that these First Nations projects were really focused on living lightly on the land. And when sustainability and the design of sustainable buildings became a larger conversation in the mainstream community, especially in the town of Banff, for example, where we were designing the new town hall, again, designing out of wood made so much sense. It's a material that is sustainable, has embodied carbon in it, and is durable and easy to maintain. So the town of Banff was very excited to have a building that was out of wood. In Hinton, for example, the Hinton Government Centre, Hinton is, of course, a wood town, and so designing in wood made all the sense in the world. But again, they were very interested in a sustainable building, and a building that really showcased sustainability at its front and center. And working with the work that we had been doing with our First Nations communities, as well as with the town itself, it was clear that this had to be a wood building too. This was in the later 90s, and it was in the very early days of the LEED Green Building movement. In fact, it was pre-LEED, but just. And so this building was one that was being considered for sort of being certified under LEED after the fact, but that actually never happened. But this building kind of bridges those worlds, and this was a little bit later. This was in the mid-2000s, and by this time LEED was alive and well. And this is a LEED Gold building at Athabasca University. It has the Center for World Indigenous Knowledge and Research, so that was a part of it. But the building itself is a wood building, not just because it has an Indigenous perspective, but because it lives on the land, lives lightly on the land, and intends to be a sustainable building for a university which is located in essentially in a forestry community. So definitely a building that wanted to showcase wood and hadn't in the past. None of their other buildings on their campus actually had wood structures or wood materials on any surfaces. Another image of that same building, you can see that really striking wood roof, and it really fits within the landscape, fits within the context, and fits within the increasing importance that's given to Indigenous worldviews at Athabasca University. Another much better known building right here in Edmonton is the LEED Platinum Mosaic Center. This was actually much more recent. This was 2015, but definitely using wood is showing up in increasing numbers of buildings that are attaining high performance living building and other sustainable standards. This one's also the first commercial building in Alberta to be net zero, so kind of integrates all of those perspectives. We continue to work with First Nations communities, designing schools, designing various cultural facilities, and consistently they remain wood buildings. And so here we were at Soddle Lake again in 2019, so almost 20 years after the first building that we completed at Soddle Lake. The second one is about to start construction, we hope, in the coming year. There are some renderings of what that building might look like, and again with lots of community involvement, again a wood structure, wood cladding, and so many materials within the building that are really building on the skills and capabilities of the community and the aspirations of the community. So this is the interior of the future Soddle Lake School, the kindergarten to grade 6 school, and we're very excited about this project and looking forward to that construction, as I said, hopefully beginning in the next little while. Another recent project that again is a wood structure for First Nation, Salt River First Nation, that's up in Fort Smith in the Northwest Territories. And we worked very closely with the community, with the chief, with the elders, with the leadership of that community, again to construct something that they could be really proud of, that could involve local labor, and that will serve them for many decades to come. This one just opened about a year ago, and so we're excited to continue this tradition of wood buildings throughout our First Nations communities. Also pretty recently opened is the Métis Crossing Gathering Centre. This one is designed for the Métis Nation of Alberta, and it's a tourism site. Has of course a wood structure, wood deck, and is designed to represent the craftsmanship that's really important to the Métis community. So lots of traditional woodworkers actually. In fact, many of the people who built early buildings across Alberta were Métis, and they also were the people who built York boats and had lots of woodworking skills. And so again, celebrating that craftsmanship in the Métis community was very much what this building was about. The Métis Crossing Gathering Centre was really interesting because not only did we focus on using wood as interior material and a structural material, but we also wanted to use wood as an exterior material and a cladding material. And we ended up having to source a preserved wood product that is unfortunately not available in Canada, but of course we were able to order it in. It'd be great if we could get a Canadian product that did that. But we want to make sure that, of course, the materials on the cladding of our buildings don't require extraordinary amounts of maintenance. And so preserved wood really made a good deal of sense for this building. And we're looking forward to seeing how this rather large terrace and the wood cladding, how they age over time. Métis Crossing Gathering Centre, then you can see those really interesting shaped wood trusses that are inspired by the Métis flag, inspired by the form of the Métis flag, but also inspired by the idea that we can create buildings that are both contemporary and traditional at the same time. And that's the challenge with buildings of this type, especially tourism buildings. And in this case, again, we used the preserved wood cladding on the exterior of the building. We did some unusual shapes with it to create some shadows and some patterns. And there's a lot, wood is such a versatile material, so we're really excited to see how this one plays out when construction is done. But also there was a huge amount of local construction. So again, that focus on local labor, local involvement, and materials that are sustainable. And there's the structure of the central drum of the school, the heartbeat of the school. And that school, as I say, is going to be opening in the next short while. So we're really excited to share with you some photographs of it when it's actually complete. So looking forward to that next step coming soon. At Métis Crossing, we're also designing a new boutique lodge, so a little hotel that's going to go beside the gathering center, and that's going to pull together that whole site and make it an even more dynamic tourism site. We've been designing and building with wood on First Nations, with First Nations for many decades. And not just with First Nations, but also so many other sustainable building projects that we've worked on with communities all over the country. And as we speak, we have another handful of buildings under design, under construction, all using wood structure for all of the reasons that I mentioned, to invite people into a conversation about materials that are sustainable, that are beautiful, and that are handcrafted. And many of these stories and many more are also in a book that's coming out this fall. So if you're curious to hear more, have a look for this book, Old Stories, New Ways, which should be out in publication in the next month or two. And check it out if you're curious. There's lots more about our work with Indigenous communities and our work with designing of buildings using wood as a primary material. Thanks very much.